Hello, world. Good morning. Welcome back. I'm so excited for another exciting episode with another podcast host. I'm here today with Dan Kihanya, who is the co founder and host of Founders Unfound, another podcast all about the entrepreneurial adventures we're all on. So, thank you so much for being here with me today, Dan.
Thank you, Joia. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about Founders Unfound, what this podcast is all about, and what inspired you to start it.
Sure. And thanks again for having me on. So, Founders Unfound essentially is just a place where we try to provide a voice and highlight underrepresented tech founders. When I was out there doing this for 20 years myself as a tech founder, I realized that there isn't as many opportunities for um, those of us who are in the sort of underrepresented categories to really get out and shine a light on what I think are the superhero powers that a lot of underrepresented founders have. They have to overcome the normal things that most entrepreneurs have to overcome. But then there's always some extra burden, friction, shackle around them that they've had to persevere through. And I think they have amazing stories. And so I wanted to get out there and try to give back a little bit to the entrepreneurial community. And this was my way to try to do that.
I love that. So give us some insight into what some of these great stories of perseverance are all about. Can you share a couple stories from your show?
Sure. I've had coming up on my sixth episode now, so we're just getting started,
Hmm.
and I'm certainly a media newbie. I'm more of a behind the scenes guy, so we're working through our formats. But we've already had some really compelling stories. Ironically, I've had I think three athletes or former athletes who actually made it to pretty elite levels, the Olympics and the NFL, for instance, and high caliber in college. And they've seemed to have turned those skills, experiences, traits into an entrepreneurial path. And it's really interesting for them to all draw the comparisons between what it's like to be an athlete, what's the commitment like to reach those elite levels, and what it takes to be a startup entrepreneur. One story certainly that resonates with me is the idea that my last interviewee talked about with this idea that life is like the 400-meter run, and this is what he did. He was a 400-meter runner, and trained for the Olympics to run for the Nigerian Olympic team. And he said that um, startups and life are like the run, where the competition doesn't start at the starting line, it starts halfway through, because that's when
Hmm.
people start to feel the pain, to feel the burn, to start to experience the you know the actual discomfort, and there's no more cruising. And he basically said the people who win are the ones who give up the least.
Hmm.
Yeah, but there's many stories, and I try to focus a lot on what it's like specifically to be underrepresented. And my first series right now is around founders of African descent, and
Hmm.
so that's the sort of storyline that we have. And so there's the good and the bad that come with that. So there's stories of mentors who have been catalysts for our entrepreneurs, but there's also stories of parts of the ecosystem, including investors, who've really been, let's just say, less encouraging. And so those stories are really interesting to hear too, because it really shows that there's a lot more work to be done, and
Hmm.
that there's a need for our podcast.
Oh, I love that. Now, I know you have your own really fascinating story of being an underrepresented founder, because this is not your first rodeo in the entrepreneurial world. So tell us more about your story and your long journey.
Sure. Yeah, I've been in the startup world for over 20 years. I went to business school in Silicon Valley to get my graduate degree in the mid 90s, which was a
Hmm.
great time to be exploring the entrepreneurial world. Was fortunate enough to co-found a company that ended up going public during that time, and it's still around. So it wasn't sort of a Super Bowl ad, fly by night, a moment of the time company. It was in the reward space. We rewarded people for doing things on the internet,
Hmm.
um, and that kind of set me on my course. I've done two others since then, and I'm on my fourth right now, which is uh, a fintech banking um, consumer app based in India.
Wow.
Yeah. The Indian market is the second largest market in the world after China. And so everything there is bigger and things grow faster. And if you do a good job with something that the Indian consumer wants, it can really explode. For instance, we're targeting the younger generation, 18 to 30-year-olds, which number in the order of 250 million people. So yeah, so I love entrepreneurship. The thing that's always drawn me is there's a problem that needs to be solved. Nobody's really looking at it, or at least not looking at it with fresh eyes. How do we take a clean piece of paper and say, how do we use the current technologies that are available to really transform and revolutionize things? So I live and breathe around startups. I love going to Founders Live. I love going to events and seeing the combination of passion and almost terrified look that young entrepreneurs have, because that's the tension that you live with every day. But I think it's the way the world gets changed and the way business gets changed for sure, is when startups sacrifice and then hopefully get rewarded for it.
Hmm. So I'm curious to hear what have been your own experiences of underrepresentation? I'm curious if there's even something about this and now moving into a new international context, because I know a lot of times, even when I think about underrepresentation, I'm thinking about the American context. But what's it like now when your entrepreneurial venture even expands outward, as you've been describing, into India or into these new international markets?
Yeah, I think the startup world is, everybody thinks about Silicon Valley, obviously,
Hmm.
and many generations ago it was places like Boston and a little bit Los Angeles, and those places still have entrepreneurial fervor, but I spent time with friends who now travel to Lebanon and Leningrad and the Ukraine and um, the Czech Republic and in Brazil, many parts of Africa, where they go and sort of plant these seeds of sort of whether it's the lean startup model or the Silicon Valley approach, but this idea of how to build something that can be very big impact, and how do you do that? And so these seeds get planted, and so you see um, the democratization, I guess you'd say, or at least the distribution of the startup mentality around the world. And India is no different. I have a partner there who's on his second startup. His first one was sold to American Express, and so it's it's really fascinating to see. And when I talk about underrepresentation, I'm talking about specifically within the tech startup world. So there are communities that are well, pretty underrepresented in the larger society, especially here in America, but have a really good presence in terms of the tech startup world. And then you have sometimes the opposite, right? It's been well cataloged and deservedly so, how women have really been um, drastically underrepresented in the tech startup founder space, for instance. And yet they're 50% of our society here in the United States. In fact, I think they're a little bit more. So, and in terms of my own personal experiences, I've kind of always prided myself as somebody who would sort of recognize something and then just say, okay, well, how do I step over that hurdle? How do I get around that? How do I, dig a hole under it? How do I leap over it? How do I sidestep it? So, um, I, and this is interesting because I think some of my interviewees also have sort of this opinion where my underrepresentation, I don't want it to be the thing that labels me or is filter by which you judge me, but I also don't want to dismiss it because there's part of it that's positive in terms of my heritage, my experience, my uniqueness. So there's a tension there, for sure, and I've felt that. Um, I've always tried to build a network that had a balanced representation, at least what I thought was a balanced representation. And I think that's helped me because then you can have the ability to share your perspective with somebody who may not have it, but you also have the ability to share with somebody who can either commiserate with you or identify with you or share in those sort of sentiments and those feelings that you have. But I I don't always recognize when I walk in a room that I'm underrepresented, but then there's times I do, and
Mhm.
so that's always an interesting mental exercise that you have to do sometimes when you're part of an underrepresented group.
Tell us more about that. Tell us about that interesting mental exercise. How does that show up for you? Because I mean, I know as a woman, I've had perhaps
Yeah,
my own experience of that, but I'm curious how that's, and I don't want to claim to speak for all women, of course, obviously. I think
sure,
in many
sure.
ways these are very individualized things as well. So, but I'm just really curious to hear how that shows up for you.
I think you hit it right at the nail right on the head there, Joya. Um, we don't represent everybody who looks like us or is similar to us, and yet sometimes you feel that burden, right? You walk in somewhere or you're talking, and it doesn't happen to me all the time, but it does happen sometimes where you think, oh, if I mess this up, then somehow what labels I have might be affected by that by the next person who walks in. But for me personally, I'm kind of an introverted guy, and so I think it comes down to sort of how welcome you feel, and depending on what the situation is, um, just sort of what the embrace is and what um, the focus of the event might be or the experience might be. Sometimes you get swept up into it and you're not even thinking about who's there or who are they or who am I. You're just, wow, okay, everybody's doing things and we're talking about stuff. And then other times you walk in and you're kind of, you know, uh, you sort of sneak in and you're in there and you're sort of wandering around and you're trying to figure out what to do and who to talk to and nobody talks to you and um, so again, I don't want to confuse my introvertedness with that, but I do think sometimes in my mind I start to think is something about who I am as opposed to just the fact that I'm not out there trying to interview or not interview people, but meet people. So for me, it's really interesting, and I think it comes down to sort of how you feel when you walk in, and there's no way to I don't know. I don't know. I'm interested in what you say, but I think it's hard to to put that into words.
Mhm.
But I think there is a feeling, and that feeling sort of kicks off a psychology in your head and some neurons about okay, this is the way this is going to be.
No, I mean, and I love what you're saying too about, because I've experienced this at least personally, that it comes down to feeling welcome. But what is it that actually makes us feel welcome? And how much of it might even be our own interpretation of things. So I think that people aren't welcoming me because I'm a
Right.
woman, but really, I mean, I'm an ambivert, I guess, but I definitely have an introverted side. So maybe for me, it's just, my own introversion getting in my own way, but I'm interpreting it in this way that maybe doesn't even match up with reality. Maybe people actually are more welcoming, but I'm just not seeing it that way. So it's really fascinating.
It is, and just to put a point in that, I think you can actually go into um, culturally or any other mechanism you want to say a diverse environment and also feel unwelcome.
Hmm.
It's not you
Hmm.
can't necessarily assume just because there's lots of different people there that there's going to be this everybody hold hands and meet each other. So I think this idea of feeling welcome is it's certainly under talked about, I think.
Hmm. Sounds to me like a problem that we ought to start solving as the entrepreneurs.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well,
Um,
we are almost out of time, but for people who are interested to hear more stories like these, I know I'm going to be really interested to check out your podcast and hear more of what you're up to. So tell people how they can find you and how they can get involved.
Absolutely. So we have a website, foundersunfound.com, and it's just the words, founders and unfound. You can also follow us at Founders Unfound on Twitter. We're on LinkedIn as well. And then to listen to the podcast, we're on all the major distribution points. So Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, um, Spotify. And so if you just search Founders Unfound, you'll find us. If you want to follow me, I'm just at Kihanya, Kihanya, at pretty much every social media handle that I've gotten that. um, and would love to hear from founders, would love to hear from investors or people in the tech community who want to tell me about what they want to hear specifically from these stories. And I definitely want to be showcasing as many founders as possible. And so if they want to reach out to me, please drop me a line, drop me a DM on Twitter, or you can email me just at dan@foundersunfound.com.
That sounds excellent. I will definitely be checking you out. So thank you so much again for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Yeah. Bye, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your morning.
Thanks for joining us today. Please don't forget to subscribe, review, and share this show. If you'd like exclusive content and behind-the-scenes insight, for just $4 a month, you can support us at buymeacoffee.com. Now, go make it a great day. Ask me why.